May 2023, Cypress Ridge, Texas, a town where life moved at an idyllic pace. Families gathered for barbecues on warm summer evenings, children played in well-manicured yards, and the hum of routine offered a sense of comfort. Among these suburban lives was the Monroe family, seemingly perfect in every way. Rachel Monroe, 40, stood on her porch, watching the sunset. Her home, nestled on a quiet cul-de-sac, was the embodiment of a happy family. She had built a life filled with love and laughter alongside her husband of 15 years, James, and their teenage daughter, Emma. To the outside world, they were flawless, a devoted wife, a successful husband, and a bright, compassionate daughter. But perfection can be deceiving. Rachel wiped her hands on her apron as she prepared dinner, the aroma of roasted chicken wafting through the house. "Emma, could you set the table?" she called, smiling at her daughter, who was sprawled on the couch scrolling through her phone. "Sure, Mom," Emma replied, hopping up and flashing a grin that reminded Rachel of the little girl who once needed her for everything. At 14, Emma was blossoming into a confident young woman. Rachel couldn't have been prouder. The door creaked open as James stepped inside, carrying his briefcase and an air of exhaustion. "Hey, family," he greeted, leaning down to kiss Rachel on the cheek. His tie was slightly loosened, and his jacket slung over one shoulder. He looked every bit the part of a hard-working, devoted husband. Rachel smiled. "Dinner's almost ready." "Long day?" "Always," he replied, avoiding eye contact as he loosened his tie further and set his briefcase on the counter. James had always been attentive, a man who prided himself on providing for his family. But lately, there had been changes. His once warm gaze seemed distant, his touches less frequent. The late-night phone calls and extended business trips were becoming more frequent, and Rachel had begun to notice small inconsistencies. That night, as they sat around the dinner table, James shared stories of his workday while Emma laughed at his witty remarks. Rachel watched her husband closely. His laugh seemed hollow, his words carefully chosen. There was something beneath the surface, a shadow she couldn't quite place. After dinner, James excused himself, retreating to his study. Rachel lingered in the kitchen, her mind swirling with doubts. Was she imagining things? Overreacting? She shook her head, willing herself to trust the man she had loved for over a decade. Later that evening, as Rachel folded laundry in their bedroom, James's phone buzzed on the nightstand. He had left it behind when he went to shower. Glancing at the screen, Rachel froze. The name Laura appeared, accompanied by a simple message, "Can't wait to see you again." Her hands trembled as she stared at the phone. Laura? Who was Laura? The words burned into her mind, igniting a storm of questions. Was this an innocent message from a colleague? A mistake? Or was it something far worse? Rachel felt a chill creep down her spine. Her instincts told her this was no accident. But confronting James right now wouldn't yield answers. Instead, she slipped the phone back onto the nightstand, her face a mask of calm as James returned to the room, towel draped over his shoulders. "You okay?" he asked, noticing her tense expression. "Just tired," Rachel replied, her voice steady, betraying none of the turmoil within her. As James climbed into bed and drifted off to sleep, Rachel lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The doubts she had pushed aside for weeks now roared to life, refusing to be silenced. She thought of the late nights, the unspoken secrets, the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. And now, Laura. The next morning, Rachel moved with purpose. She began to quietly observe James, noting his every move. When he packed his suitcase for another business trip, she checked the contents. Tucked beneath neatly folded shirts, she found something that made her heart race, a delicate silver bracelet, far too feminine to be his. It wasn't hers either. Rachel's mind raced as she held the bracelet in her hands. Was it a gift? For whom? Why hadn't he mentioned it? Her stomach churned, and she quickly returned the bracelet to its place. She couldn't ignore the signs anymore. Something was wrong. Very wrong. And Rachel was determined to find out what. As James kissed her goodbye and headed out the door, Rachel forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. She had always believed their marriage was unshakable, a fortress built on love and trust. But now, cracks were beginning to show, and Rachel couldn't ignore the feeling that her world was about to change forever. June 2023, Cypress Ridge, Texas. Summer had fully arrived, the days long and sweltering, the evening stretching into the humid night. But in the Monroe household, the heat wasn't just from the weather. There was an undercurrent of tension, a slow-burning doubt that had taken root in Rachel's chest. The image of James's phone screen, the name Laura, haunted her thoughts day and night. She had tried to push it aside, to tell herself she was overreacting, but the nagging feeling refused to go away. Rachel's routine became a blur of quiet observation. She wasn't paranoid, she was simply attentive. After all, something didn't add up. James's behavior had changed. He had started to work longer hours, returning late and retreating into his office with barely a word. And when he was home, his mind seemed elsewhere, distracted, distant, as if he were living in a separate world, one that didn't include her. It was the small things that kept her awake at night. One morning, Rachel woke up early to prepare breakfast. As she walked past the living room, she noticed James's car keys on the side table, something he never forgot. A second glance revealed a folded piece of paper sticking out from beneath the keys. Her heart skipped a beat. She knew she shouldn't pry, but something pulled her closer. Carefully, she slid the paper out, unfolding it with trembling hands. It was a receipt from a local hotel, the Ridgeview Inn, dated 2 days prior. The item listed was a king-sized room with late checkout. Her breath caught in her throat. Why would James need a hotel room? He had never mentioned any business trips that week, let alone staying overnight. The receipt felt like a punch to her gut. Rachel fought the urge to vomit. Could this be connected to Laura? Was he staying at the Ridgeview Inn with someone else? Her mind raced. She wanted to confront him. To demand answers. But something held her back, something darker than just fear. She didn't want to face the truth. She didn't want to destroy the life she had spent so long building. So, instead, she did what she knew best, she played the role of the perfect wife. She made breakfast, served it to James and Emma, and pretended like everything was normal. That day, Rachel stayed home, feeling the weight of her suspicions growing with each passing hour. As soon as James left for work, she sprang into action. She knew she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. She drove to the Ridgeview Inn, trying to keep her nerves steady. The hotel was only 15 minutes from their house, but it felt like an eternity. Her palms were clammy, her mind spinning. What would she even say to the front desk clerk? She wasn't sure what she was looking for, just something that could confirm what she feared. The hotel was a quaint, old-fashioned building, nestled between towering oak trees. Rachel hesitated for a moment, taking a deep breath. She approached the front desk, where an elderly woman smiled up at her. "Can I help you, ma'am?" the clerk asked in a warm, friendly tone. Rachel's voice was steady as she spoke. "I was wondering if you could help me. My husband, James Monroe, he stayed here recently. I just need to confirm the dates of his visit." The clerk's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. "Let me check our records." The elderly woman clicked away on the computer for a few moments before looking up. "I'm sorry, I don't see anyone by that name on our recent check-ins." Rachel's stomach dropped. Was the clerk lying? Or had James used a different name? She forced a smile, thanked the woman, and walked out of the hotel, her mind swirling. She knew she needed to get to the truth, but she couldn't help feeling as though the walls were closing in around her. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore, it was about her identity, her trust. Was the man she loved the same person she thought he was? Later that evening, after dinner, Rachel quietly sat by herself in the living room, watching James from across the room. He was absorbed in his phone, his thumb scrolling absent-mindedly. She could feel the heaviness of the silence between them. Emma was upstairs, doing her homework, leaving the house eerily still. Suddenly, James's phone buzzed, a notification. His face lit up briefly as he glanced at the screen. Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She had to know. She told herself it was just a message, nothing more. But her legs moved before her mind could protest. She stood up and walked over to where he sat. "James," she said, her voice calm but firm, "who's Laura?" James's head snapped up. His expression froze, the color draining from his face. For a brief moment, the room felt like it was spinning, the silence deafening. "Laura," he repeated, his voice tight, barely above a whisper. Rachel didn't wait for him to explain. She already knew the answer. It was all in his eyes. The guilt. The panic. The unspoken truth that was suddenly too loud to ignore. She had caught him. I don't know what you mean," James stammered, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. "Rachel, please." Her pulse quickened. She had always thought she could trust him. But now, every ounce of that trust was crumbling. He had been lying to her, living a life she knew nothing about. Rachel stood still, her breath shallow, as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. Her world was unraveling, and there was no turning back now. The next few days were a blur. Rachel's mind was a constant whirlwind of questions and anger. She wanted to scream, to throw things, to demand answers. But instead, she did nothing. She went through the motions. She made meals. She helped Emma with her school projects. She smiled when people asked how she was doing, but inside, she was consumed with rage. She knew something needed to be done. But she wasn't sure what. She was standing at a crossroads: confront James now and risk destroying everything, or follow the trail and get the proof she needed to expose him for what he truly was. But one thing was clear: Rachel Monroe was no longer the naive, trusting wife she had once been. The Rachel Monroe of today was a woman scorned, a woman who would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. It was late June when Rachel Monroe decided she couldn't wait any longer. The doubts that had consumed her for weeks were now unbearable. Her suspicions about James weren't just nagging thoughts anymore, they were a storm she couldn't escape. And that storm was about to break. That morning, James kissed her on the cheek before leaving for another business trip. "It's just a couple of days in Austin," he said casually, slipping his suitcase into the trunk of his car. "I'll call you when I get to the hotel." Rachel nodded, managing a tight smile. But her heart was pounding. She had heard this line too many times before. As James drove away, Rachel stood on the porch, watching until his car disappeared down the street. Then she turned, walked into the house, and grabbed her keys. This time, she wasn't going to sit and wait. She was going to follow him. Rachel kept a safe distance as she trailed James's car down the highway. The sun glared against her windshield, but her grip on the steering wheel was steady, her focus sharp. The GPS tracker she had installed on his car a week earlier had confirmed that his trips to Austin weren't for work. But she needed to see it with her own eyes. Her stomach churned as James exited the highway and turned into a suburban neighborhood in Austin. It was a charming area, with neatly trimmed lawns and modest houses painted in soft pastel colors. Rachel slowed her car as James pulled into the driveway of a small white house with green shutters. He parked, got out, and walked to the front door. The way he moved, relaxed, almost happy, felt like a slap to Rachel's face. And then she saw her. A woman stepped out onto the porch, her brown hair catching the sunlight. She was younger than Rachel, with a warm smile that lit up her face. She greeted James with open arms, and he embraced her without hesitation. Rachel's breath caught in her throat as she watched them exchange a kiss, casual and intimate, like they had done it 1,000 times before. Rachel sat frozen in her car, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. James wasn't just lying about work trips. He was living a double life. The woman, Laura, Rachel realized, wasn't alone. A moment later, a young boy ran out onto the porch, laughing as he threw his arms around James's legs. "Daddy," the boy exclaimed, his voice carrying across the quiet street. Rachel's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Her chest felt heavy, her throat constricted. She wanted to scream, to burst out of the car and confront him right there. But instead, she stayed put, the weight of her discovery sinking in. This wasn't a fling. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This was an entire second family, a wife, a child, a life James had kept hidden from her for years. Rachel's thoughts spiraled as she drove back to Cypress Ridge. She replayed the scene over and over in her mind, James's easy smile, Laura's embrace, the boy calling him Daddy. The betrayal was sharper than any physical pain she had ever felt. How could he do this to her? To Emma? By the time she pulled into her driveway, her grief had transformed into anger. The kind of anger that demanded action. That night, Rachel waited until Emma had gone to bed before she sat down with James's laptop. She had always trusted him enough to respect his privacy, but that trust was gone now. With shaking hands, she opened his email account. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. Emails to Laura filled the screen. Messages about their son, Miles. Plans for family outings. Love letters that made Rachel's stomach turn. One email in particular stood out, an itinerary for a weekend trip James had planned for Laura and Miles. A trip he had claimed was a work conference. Rachel's hands trembled as she closed the laptop. Her chest burned with fury. She wanted to confront him immediately, to throw the evidence in his face and demand answers. But something stopped her. If she rushed in now, she wouldn't just lose control, she'd lose her chance to expose him completely. The next morning, Rachel called her sister, Grace, who lived a few towns over. "I need you to take Emma for the weekend," she said, her voice firm but strained. Grace didn't press for details, she could hear in Rachel's tone that this wasn't a request but a plea. By the afternoon, Emma was packed and on her way to Grace's house, leaving Rachel alone in the empty Monroe home. She sat in the living room, staring at a printed copy of the email itinerary. Austin, it read. Laura and Miles. Ridgefield Park. Saturday, 10 a.m. Rachel's jaw tightened. She wasn't just going to confront James. She was going to catch him in the act. That Saturday morning, Rachel drove to Ridgefield Park in Austin, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The park was a popular spot, with walking trails and picnic tables scattered under shady oak trees. As she pulled into the parking lot, her eyes scanned the area. And then she saw them. James was sitting on a picnic blanket with Laura and Miles. They looked like a picture-perfect family, laughing and playing with a frisbee. Miles's giggles echoed through the park as James lifted him onto his shoulders. Laura leaned against James, her hand resting on his arm. Rachel felt a surge of rage rise in her chest. She stepped out of her car, her fists clenched, ready to march over and shatter the illusion. But something stopped her. Watching them from a distance, she realized this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about Emma. About the life James had stolen from her, the lies he had woven around them both. As tears blurred her vision, Rachel turned and walked back to her car. She wasn't ready, not yet. But she knew one thing for certain, James Monroe's perfect life was about to come crashing down. And she was going to make sure of it. It was late evening when James returned home from his business trip. The air in the Monroe house felt heavy, almost suffocating. Rachel had spent the day pacing the kitchen, her mind racing through every possible scenario of how the confrontation might unfold. She had rehearsed her words, steeled her nerves, and prepared herself for the storm to come. James walked through the door, his usual briefcase in hand, and smiled as if everything was perfectly normal. "Hey, honey," he said casually, setting his keys on the counter. "How was your day?" Rachel looked up from the dining table, where she sat with her laptop open and a stack of papers beside her. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were ice. "We need to talk," she said, her voice sharp but controlled. James froze mid-step. Something in her tone stopped him cold. "What's wrong?" he asked cautiously, his smile faltering. Rachel stood and walked toward him, her gaze never leaving his face. She held up a printed email itinerary, the one she had found on his laptop. Austin. Laura and Miles. A family weekend at Ridgefield Park. Her voice cracked slightly, but she held her composure. "Do those names sound familiar to you?" James's face went pale. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he stared at the paper in her hand, his expression a mix of shock and guilt. Rachel didn't wait for him to recover. "How long?" she demanded, her voice rising. "How long have you been lying to me? To Emma? To both of us?" James stumbled over his words. "Rachel, I can explain." "Explain?" Rachel snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "Explain what, James? That you've been living a double life? That you have another wife? Another child? How do you explain that?" James raised his hands, as if to calm her, but the panic in his eyes betrayed him. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice weak. "I never meant for this to happen." Rachel let out a bitter laugh. "Not what I think? You've been lying to me for years, James. Years. I trusted you. I built a life with you. And all this time, you've been sneaking off to Austin to play house with another family." James looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "It's complicated," he muttered. "Complicated?" Rachel's voice cracked, and tears welled up in her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "No, James, it's not complicated. It's simple. You betrayed me. You betrayed Emma. You betrayed everything we built together." James finally looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. "Rachel, please. Just let me explain. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why did you do it?" Rachel demanded, her voice breaking. "Why?" James hesitated, his jaw tightening. "It started before we got married," he admitted quietly. "Laura, she was pregnant. I felt responsible. I promised her I would be there for her and the baby. But then I met you, and everything changed. I fell in love with you, Rachel. I wanted a life with you. But I couldn't abandon them." Rachel's hands shook as she listened to his words. "So, what? You thought you could have it all? 2 wives? 2 families? Did you think I'd never find out?" "I thought I could manage it," James said, his voice cracking. "I thought I could keep the 2 worlds separate. I didn't want to lose you." "But you did," Rachel said coldly, her tears now streaming freely. "You lost me the moment you decided to lie. You lost me the moment you chose to live a double life." James stepped closer, reaching for her hand, but she pulled away sharply. "Rachel, please. I'll fix this. I'll end things with Laura. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." "It's too late for that," Rachel said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned away, her shoulders trembling with the weight of her anger and sorrow. You didn't just betray me, James. You destroyed our family. James's face twisted in anguish. Rachel, I love you. I love Emma. Please don't do this. Rachel spun around to face him, her eyes blazing. Don't do what, James? Don't hold you accountable? Don't expose you for the liar you are? You've spent years deceiving me, and now you want me to protect your secret? No. I'm done. Her words hung in the air like a heavy weight. James's expression shifted from pleading to panic. What do you mean, done? He asked, his voice trembling. Rachel straightened her shoulders, her resolve hardening. I mean, I'm done living a lie. I'm done pretending everything is fine. I'm done protecting you. I'm filing for divorce, and I'm telling Emma the truth. James's face turned ashen. Rachel, you can't. I can, she interrupted, her voice firm. And I will. The room fell silent, the tension thick and suffocating. Rachel could see the fear in James's eyes, the realization that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. As she walked past him toward the stairs, she paused, turning back to deliver one final blow. You think you can fix this, James? There's no fixing what you've done. You didn't just break my heart, you broke our lives. And now, you'll have to live with that. She left him standing there, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of defeat. Upstairs, Rachel closed her bedroom door and sank onto the bed, her body trembling. She had finally confronted him, finally spoken the truth. But the weight of what came next was still crushing. Her marriage was over, her family shattered. But one thing was certain, Rachel Monroe would not let James's lies define her future. The morning after the confrontation, the Monroe household was cloaked in a suffocating silence. Rachel stayed upstairs in her room, her mind still reeling from the argument the night before. James, on the other hand, was pacing downstairs, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The facade he had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling, and the consequences of Rachel's resolve to expose him were more than he could bear. He glanced at his phone on the kitchen counter. He had received no messages from Laura. He hadn't told her about Rachel's discovery, how could he? Panic coursed through him as he envisioned the fallout. Rachel would tell Emma. She would go to Laura. Both families would be destroyed. His life would unravel, his career in tatters, his reputation obliterated. The thought of losing everything sent a chill down his spine. Upstairs, Rachel was packing a suitcase. She had already made up her mind, she would leave that evening with Emma, who was still at her Aunt Grace's house. There was no turning back now. Rachel had called her lawyer that morning, initiating the divorce proceedings, and she intended to confront James one last time before walking away for good. As Rachel zipped her suitcase shut, she heard footsteps on the stairs. James appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes bloodshot. Rachel, he said, his voice low, almost pleading. We need to talk. Rachel straightened, folding her arms across her chest. There's nothing left to talk about, James. I'm leaving, and I'm taking Emma with me. James stepped into the room, his movements tense. You don't have to do this. We can work through this. I'll fix it. I'll end things with Laura. Stop, Rachel cut him off, her voice sharp. It's over, James. You don't get to negotiate your way out of this. You lied to me. To Emma. To everyone. There's nothing left to fix. James's face darkened, his desperation turning into something colder, something dangerous. Do you have any idea what will happen if you tell Emma? If you tell Laura? You'll ruin everything. Rachel's jaw tightened. I'm not the one who ruined everything, James. You did. You made this mess, and now you have to live with it. James's hands clenched into fists at his sides. You're going to destroy both families, Rachel. Do you even care what this will do to Emma? To Miles? They're innocent in all of this. Rachel took a step closer, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare talk to me about innocence. You've been lying to us for years. Emma deserves to know the truth. Laura deserves to know the truth. You don't get to play the victim here. James's breathing grew heavier, his chest rising and falling as his emotions spiraled out of control. You can't do this, he said, his voice rising. You can't just walk away and blow up my life. Rachel scoffed, shaking her head. Blow up your life? You mean the life you've been living at my expense? The lies you've told? The families you've deceived? This isn't about you, James. This is about the truth. James's composure snapped. If you leave, you'll regret it, he said through gritted teeth, his voice trembling with rage. I'll make sure of it. Rachel's eyes narrowed. Is that a threat? She asked, her voice steady, unyielding. James took a step closer, his hands trembling. You're not thinking clearly. You're making a mistake. Rachel stood her ground, her chin raised defiantly. The only mistake I made was trusting you. Something in James's expression changed. His desperation morphed into something darker, something unrecognizable. Before Rachel could react, he lunged forward, grabbing her by the arm. Let go of me. Rachel shouted, struggling to free herself. But James's grip was ironclad, his rage boiling over. Why couldn't you just let this go? He hissed, his voice trembling with fury. Why couldn't you just stay quiet? Rachel fought against him, her voice rising in panic. You're hurting me, James. Let me go. In a blur of movement, James shoved her backward. Rachel stumbled, her foot catching on the edge of the suitcase she had packed. She lost her balance, falling hard against the corner of the dresser. The sharp edge struck her head with a sickening thud, and she crumpled to the floor. The room fell silent, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. James stood frozen, staring at Rachel's motionless body. His breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of his actions sank in. Rachel, he whispered, his voice trembling. He dropped to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulder. Rachel, wake up. Please wake up. But she didn't move. James's mind raced as panic took hold. This wasn't supposed to happen. He hadn't meant for this to happen. What would he do now? He couldn't call the police, they would never believe it was an accident. He had to think, had to act quickly. With trembling hands, James lifted Rachel's lifeless body and carried her downstairs. He staged the scene in the living room, scattering a few items to make it look like she had tripped and fallen. His hands were shaking as he dialed 911. My wife, he stammered when the operator answered. She fell. I think she hit her head. Please, send help. As he ended the call, James sat on the couch, his head in his hands. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him like a vice. He had crossed a line, one he could never come back from. And no amount of lies could cover the truth of what had just happened. Rachel Monroe was gone. And James's carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down. The morning after Rachel's death, Cypress Ridge was quiet, its suburban calm masking the tragedy that had unfolded in the Monroe household. Police cars lined the street as curious neighbors peeked out from behind their curtains, whispering speculations. Inside the house, Detective Alan Hayes stood in the living room, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. James Monroe sat on the couch, his head in his hands. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face pale. He looked every bit the grieving husband. But Detective Hayes had seen too many crime scenes to be swayed by appearances. So, Mr. Monroe, Hayes began, his voice steady but probing, you're saying your wife fell? James nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. She was coming down the stairs. She must have tripped over something. When I found her, she wasn't breathing. I called 911 right away. Hayes crouched beside Rachel's body, now covered with a white sheet. The blood pooled around her head told a story, but it didn't quite match the one James was telling. Hayes glanced at the dresser in the bedroom upstairs, where Rachel had struck her head, and then at the scattered items in the living room below. Something didn't add up. Hayes murmured, rising to his feet. He motioned for the forensic team to continue their work. Turning back to James, he asked, "Was anyone else here last night?" James shook his head. "No, it was just us. Emma, our daughter, was staying with her aunt." "And you didn't see or hear anything unusual before the fall?" Hayes pressed, watching James closely. James hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. "No. She was upset. We'd had an argument earlier, but she went to bed before I did." Hayes nodded, his expression unreadable. "I see." Over the next few days, the investigation began in earnest. At first glance, Rachel's death seemed like a tragic accident. But the more Hayes and his team dug, the more inconsistencies they uncovered. The forensic evidence was the first red flag. The bruising on Rachel's arm was consistent with someone gripping her forcefully, not with a fall. The angle of her head wound suggested an impact from a specific height, likely the edge of the dresser upstairs, not the floor of the living room, where James claimed she fell. Then there were the phone records. Hayes subpoenaed James's call logs and found a string of messages and calls to an unknown number, one that was later traced to Laura Taylor in Austin. When questioned, Laura revealed the shocking truth: James had been living a double life. "I didn't know he was married," Laura told Hayes, her voice shaking. "He told me he was a widower. He said his wife had died years ago, and that his daughter was estranged from him." Hayes's jaw tightened. It wasn't just the deception that angered him, it was the sheer audacity. James had built a house of cards, and Rachel had paid the price for his lies. Meanwhile, Emma returned home, confused and heartbroken over her mother's sudden death. She had always trusted her father, but now, things didn't feel right. The house felt different, darker, colder. And then there were the arguments. Emma remembered overhearing her parents fighting in the days leading up to her mother's death. Her mother's voice, sharp and angry, echoed in her memory. "I didn't think much of it at the time," Emma told Hayes during her interview. "But now, I don't know. Mom was really upset. She said something about Dad lying to her." Emma's testimony added another layer to the case, painting a picture of a marriage unraveling under the weight of secrets. As Hayes pieced together the evidence, he began to see the bigger picture. James's financial records revealed frequent charges at hotels and restaurants in Austin, expenses he had disguised as business trips. Colleagues confirmed that James had been taking more time off than usual, often without explanation. And Laura, now fully aware of James's betrayal, handed over emails and text messages that proved the extent of his double life. The final piece of the puzzle came from Rachel herself. During a search of the house, Hayes's team discovered a voice recorder tucked into one of Rachel's dresser drawers. On it was a conversation Rachel had secretly recorded the night before her death. Her voice was steady but filled with fury as she confronted James about Laura and Miles. "You think you can just lie to me? To Emma? To everyone?" Rachel's voice crackled through the recorder. "You're a coward, James. A liar." James's voice followed, trembling with anger. "You don't understand. I didn't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Rachel shot back. "And you chose to betray me." The recording ended abruptly, but it was enough. Combined with the forensic evidence, the financial records, and the testimonies from Laura and Emma, it was clear that Rachel's death was no accident. By the end of the week, Detective Hayes had enough to confront James. The arrest was swift and quiet, with James led out of his house in handcuffs as neighbors watched from their windows. His face was a mask of defeat, his carefully constructed life in ruins. At the station, Hayes leaned across the interrogation table, his voice calm but firm. "You had every chance to come clean, Mr. Monroe. But you didn't. And now, your lies have caught up with you." James didn't respond. He simply stared at the table, his hands trembling. "You killed your wife," Hayes continued. "Maybe it wasn't premeditated. Maybe it was an accident. But you chose to cover it up. And for that, you're going to pay." As Hayes walked out of the room, he felt a grim satisfaction. Rachel's death was a tragedy, but at least now, the truth had been uncovered. And James Monroe would finally face the consequences of his actions. November 2023, Cypress Ridge, Texas. 6 months after Rachel's tragic death, the Monroe house sat empty, its windows dark and lifeless. The once vibrant home was now a shell of what it had been, a silent monument to the betrayal and tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. James Monroe stood in a courtroom, his hands shackled in front of him, his face gaunt and pale. The trial had been swift but thorough, with the prosecution laying out an airtight case against him. Forensic evidence, financial records, testimonies from Laura and Emma, and Rachel's damning recording all painted a chilling picture of a man who had let his lies spiral into violence. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning with their verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. As the judge read out James's sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, he showed no emotion. The man who had spent years crafting a perfect image was now a broken shadow of himself. His lies had cost him everything: his wife, his family, his freedom. In the weeks following the trial, Emma struggled to adjust to her new reality. Losing her mother had left a void that nothing could fill, and the revelation of her father's betrayal had shattered her sense of security. But Emma was resilient. With the support of her Aunt Grace, she began therapy to process her grief and rebuild her life. On a chilly November morning, Emma visited her mother's grave for the first time since the trial. She knelt by the headstone, tracing her fingers over Rachel's name etched in granite. "I miss you, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I wish you were here." Tears streamed down her face as she spoke. "Dad, he wasn't who I thought he was. But you were. You were everything good in my life, and I'll never forget that. I'll make you proud, I promise." As Emma stood to leave, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in months. Her mother's strength lived on in her, and she was determined to honor Rachel's memory by living a life of integrity and resilience. Meanwhile, Laura Taylor, reeling from the betrayal of the man she thought she knew, decided to leave Austin. She packed up her belongings and moved to Colorado, seeking a fresh start for herself and her son, Miles. She would never forget the pain James had caused her, but she refused to let his lies define her future. Miles, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, often asked about Daddy. Laura chose her words carefully, focusing on the importance of truth and love without delving into the darker realities. She vowed to raise Miles with the values James had failed to embody. Detective Alan Hayes, who had seen his fair share of tragedies, couldn't shake the weight of the Monroe case. It wasn't just the crime itself, it was the layers of deceit, the lives torn apart by one man's selfishness. As he closed the file for the last time, he reflected on Rachel's courage. In her final moments, she had stood up for the truth, even at great personal cost. As the case faded from the headlines, the community of Cypress Ridge grappled with the lessons it had left behind. Secrets, no matter how well hidden, had a way of surfacing. And lies, no matter how carefully constructed, always carried consequences. Rachel Monroe's death was a reminder of the devastating power of betrayal. But her life, her strength, her love, her determination, was a testament to the enduring power of truth. What do you think of James's actions? Do you believe his lies could have been uncovered sooner? How would you have reacted if you were in Rachel's position? Would you have confronted James immediately or gathered evidence like she did? What lessons can we take from this story about trust, betrayal, and the power of truth? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.